22 years, and all I ever wanted was for them to finally see you the way I do.
What is this?
I'm so sorry.
Well, some things were bound to come out eventually.
"200 people watched him lose his wife in under a minute, and not one of them looked away. What none of them knew, including Marcus, was that the woman who had just humiliated him in front of everyone he loved was about to do something in the next 10 minutes that would make every single person in that room regret the way they had just looked at him. 22 years of marriage, 22 years of Marcus Whitfield proving himself at every holiday dinner, every business dinner, every quiet comment about where he came from, to a family that had never once looked at him like he belonged in it. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to be the night the Whitfield name finally meant something in that room. Instead, the first word on that page hit him harder than any raised voice ever could. Divorce. Not whispered in private, not delivered in a lawyer's office. Delivered at his own anniversary party, in front of the one family that had spent 2 decades waiting for a reason to say they had been right about him all along. Marcus stood there, holding the papers that ended his marriage, surrounded by 200 witnesses to what looked, from every angle in that room, like the most public humiliation of his life. But cameras don't lie, and neither does fear, and if anyone in that room had looked closely enough at Renata's hands in that exact moment, they would have noticed she wasn't smiling at all. She was shaking. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened over the next 10 minutes in that ballroom would completely reverse everything every single guest believed they had just witnessed. This wasn't the story of a wife tired of an imperfect marriage. This wasn't the story of a family finally exposing a man they never approved of. This was the story of a woman who had spent the last 3 weeks of her life more terrified than she had ever been, forced into a decision that would either save her husband's future or destroy her family's darkest secret. And there was no version of that night where she walked away without losing something. What looked like betrayal in front of 200 guests was about to be revealed as something far more complicated and far more dangerous than anyone standing in that room could have imagined. Every phone in that room was already recording, every whisper already spreading, every version of the story already being rewritten in real time by people who thought they understood what they had just seen. Diane Calloway believed the moment belonged to her family. Bradley believed the debt he owed people far more dangerous than his mother realized had just been quietly settled. And Renata believed, standing alone in the middle of the ballroom she had just detonated her own marriage inside of, that she had finally protected the 2 people she loved most, even if neither of them would ever forgive her for how she did it. What none of them understood yet was that Marcus Whitfield had spent 22 years being underestimated by that family, and the quiet way he walked out of that ballroom was not the walk of a broken man. It was the walk of a man who had already started asking the one question none of them were prepared for him to ask. Not why did she do this to me, but what was she protecting me from? To understand what happened in that ballroom, you have to understand who Marcus Whitfield really was before that night, and who the Calloway family had always believed him to be. Because this is not simply a story about a marriage that ended in front of 200 witnesses. This is a story about a debt one family kept hidden for years, a company on the verge of a merger that would change hundreds of lives, and a wife who chose to be hated by the man she loved rather than let him become the next casualty of a secret her own mother had been carrying since before Renata ever said yes to marrying him. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly why she did what she did, and whether you would have been strong enough to do the same thing in her place. There are 3 questions that matter more than any other in this story, and we are going to answer every one of them before the end. First, Why would a woman humiliate the man she had spent 22 years building a life with, in the most public way possible, instead of simply asking for a quiet divorce behind closed doors? Second, what did the Calloway family actually gain from watching that marriage collapse in front of 200 witnesses, and why did Diane Calloway seem to already know exactly what was inside that envelope before Marcus ever opened it? And third, why would the same woman who destroyed her husband's reputation in front of everyone he respected be the one, 3 weeks later, on her knees outside his office, begging him to let her explain? There is one more piece of this story worth understanding before we go any further, because it is the piece that explains why the timing of that anniversary party mattered so much more than a simple end to a marriage ever could. Marcus's company was not just his own legacy. It employed nearly 300 people across the Carolinas, drivers and warehouse staff and dispatch coordinators, many of whom had worked alongside him since the earliest years in that single leased warehouse. The merger closing meant retirement security for men and women who had spent decades building roots and relationships with him, people who trusted Marcus the way family trusts family. Whoever wanted that merger delayed was not simply threatening Marcus's marriage. They were threatening the futures of nearly 300 people who had no idea their livelihoods were being used as leverage in a family's private war. Marcus Whitfield was 41 years old when he met Renata Calloway, a man who had built a mid-sized logistics company out of a single leased warehouse and 12 years of 18-hour days. He had grown up in a modest home outside Charlotte, the son of a mechanic and a school cafeteria worker, and every dollar he had ever earned, he had earned by outworking men who started 10 steps ahead of him. Renata came from a different world entirely. Her family's name had been attached to Charlotte real estate and old banking money for 3 generations, and when she brought Marcus home for the first time, her mother Diane did not bother hiding her disappointment. Marcus never asked Renata to choose between him and her family. He simply spent the next 22 years quietly proving, dinner after dinner, that he belonged in rooms the Calloways never wanted to let him into. There was one Thanksgiving, early in the marriage, that Marcus never spoke about but never fully forgot either. Diane had seated him at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door, while extended cousins and family friends filled the seats closer to the head of the table, where Renata sat beside her. Diane spent the meal asking pointed questions about Marcus's business, questions dressed up as curiosity but sharpened at the edges, wondering aloud whether a warehouse business could really support a family the way the Calloway name always had. Marcus answered every question calmly, never raising his voice, never taking the bait, and when the meal ended, he thanked Diane for having him, the same way he had every year before and every year after. Renata noticed. She always noticed. She simply didn't yet understand what it was costing her to watch it happen, year after year, without saying anything. Bradley, for his part, never seemed to notice Marcus at all, not out of hostility, but out of a kind of indifference that came from never having built anything of his own to be threatened by. He drifted from one business venture to another throughout his 20s and 30s, a restaurant that closed within a year, an investment fund that lost most of its backers' money before Bradley ever saw a return, a real estate flip that left him owing more than the property was worth. Each failure was quietly absorbed by Diane, written off at family gatherings as bad luck or bad timing, never as a pattern. Marcus watched it happen from a distance for years, never commenting, never judging out loud, focused entirely on the company he was building one contract at a time, never imagining that Bradley's failures would eventually reach far enough to touch his own life. Renata was different from her mother in almost every way that mattered. Where Diane measured people by the size of their name, Renata had fallen in love with the size of Marcus's ambition, the way he spoke about the workers on his warehouse floor like they were family, the way he remembered every driver's kid's birthday, even during his busiest quarters. She married him against her mother's wishes, and for the first several years, Diane kept her distance, showing up only for holidays, offering comments about Marcus's background disguised as concern. Bradley, Renata's younger brother, never built anything of his own. He drifted through failed investments funded by his mother's money, each one quietly absorbed and forgiven, each failure adding to a debt that nobody outside the family fully understood the size of. Marcus paid it little attention. He had a company to build and a marriage to protect. By the time their daughter Sophia turned 20, Marcus's company had grown into one of the most respected logistics operations in the Carolinas, and a national merger was quietly being finalized, one that would have made Marcus and every long-term employee at his company financially secure for the rest of their lives. Sophia had grown up caught between two very different definitions of family: her father's warehouse floor loyalty and her grandmother's careful social calculations, and she had spent most of her childhood learning to move fluidly between both worlds without fully belonging to either. She adored her father in a way that never wavered, riding along on weekend deliveries as a child, memorizing the names of drivers Marcus considered family. But she also loved her mother deeply, and by extension, understood Diane's world well enough to know that beneath the polished dinners and careful conversation, something about her grandmother's control over the family had always felt heavier than it should have. It was that same instinct, sharpened over 20 years of watching the space between her parents and grandmother, that would eventually make Sophia the one person in this entire story who refused to accept the easiest explanation for what happened at the anniversary party. It should have been the proudest season of his life. Instead, in the months leading up to the anniversary party, Renata began pulling away in ways Marcus couldn't explain. She stopped sleeping through the night. She took private phone calls in the garage with the door closed. She flinched whenever her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. Marcus assumed it was stress from planning the anniversary party. He had no idea it was something far heavier than that. Looking back, there were smaller moments Marcus would replay endlessly in the weeks after the party, moments that meant nothing at the time and everything in hindsight. Renata asking, almost too casually, whether the merger paperwork listed the company under his name alone or under both their names jointly. Renata suggesting, out of nowhere, that maybe they should scale back the anniversary party to something smaller and more private, an idea Diane had quickly and firmly overruled, insisting the full ballroom celebration was already planned and could not be changed. Renata, sitting in the car outside Gordon Kessler's office one afternoon, telling Marcus she was simply dropping off paperwork for her mother's estate planning, a lie so smooth and so unlike her that Marcus never thought to question it. Each of these moments, alone, was nothing. Together, they were the outline of a plan Renata had been forced into, piece by piece, 3 weeks before anyone else in that ballroom would understand what any of it meant. What Marcus didn't know, and what none of the 200 guests standing in that ballroom knew either, was that Bradley Calloway's debts had finally caught up to him in a way his mother's money could no longer quietly absorb. The people Bradley owed were not banks. They were not patient. And 3 weeks before that anniversary party, Diane Calloway received a phone call that would force her to make a decision that put her daughter's marriage on the table as collateral, whether Renata agreed to it or not. The weeks leading up to the anniversary party moved differently than any other season of their marriage. Renata began asking Marcus questions she had never asked before, questions about the merger paperwork, about which accounts were solely in his name, about how quickly certain assets could be moved or frozen if something went wrong. Marcus, focused on closing the biggest deal of his career, answered her honestly, assuming her sudden interest was simply her wanting to be more involved in his business the way she always said she wished she could be. He had no idea he was answering questions written for her by someone else, questions designed to determine exactly how much leverage a public divorce filing could create against him during a merger that could not afford even a hint of instability in its final weeks. Gordon Kessler, the Calloway family's longtime attorney, had drafted the divorce papers 2 full weeks before the party, working directly with Diane rather than with Renata. Renata was told, in a conversation that left her sick to her stomach for hours afterward, exactly what would happen to Bradley if she refused to sign, and exactly what would happen to Marcus's company if she did. Diane framed it as protection. If Renata filed publicly, humiliatingly, undeniably, at the one event 200 witnesses would attend, it would create enough doubt around Marcus's stability to delay the merger's closing date by months, buying the family time to quietly repay Bradley's debt through channels Marcus would never be told about. Renata was not being asked to end her marriage. She was being used as the only lever her mother had left to pull. Renata spent 3 sleepless nights, deciding whether to warn Marcus outright and risk exposing her brother to men Diane swore would not hesitate to hurt him, or to protect her husband the only way her mother had left available to her, by becoming, for one single night, the villain of her own marriage. She chose to protect both of them the only way she believed she could. She did not know, standing at that podium with the envelope in her hands, whether Marcus would ever forgive her for what she was about to do. She only knew that if she said nothing and did nothing, the consequences waiting for her brother and eventually for Marcus's company once the debt collectors ran out of patience would be far worse than one night of public shame. The night of the party arrived exactly as Diane had planned it. The string quartet played through the first 60 minutes without incident. Guests toasted Marcus's success, his generosity toward his employees, the 22 years he had built with a woman everyone assumed adored him completely. When the moment came for Renata to stand and speak, the room quieted with genuine warmth, expecting a love story. Instead, she reached into her handbag with hands she could not fully steady, and placed the envelope into her husband's hands without a single word of explanation, exactly as she had been instructed to. Diane watched from 3 tables away, her expression carefully arranged into shock for anyone who might look her way, while underneath it, she was doing the math on exactly how many months this single moment had just bought her family. Marcus's reaction was the one variable Diane had not accounted for. She had expected him to raise his voice, to demand answers in front of everyone, to hand her family the public breakdown they needed to justify what was coming next. Instead, Marcus read the papers in complete silence, closed the envelope, looked at Renata for exactly 3 seconds, and walked toward the exit without a single word. Bradley, standing near the bar, was already recording on his phone, certain the video would circulate for weeks as proof of the family finally exposing the man they never wanted. Sophia had been sitting 3 tables away when it happened, close enough to see her mother's hands before anyone else did. She watched Renata reach into her handbag, watched her fingers tremble around the edges of the envelope, watched the half-second hesitation before she placed it into her father's hands, a hesitation that looked, to Sophia, nothing like triumph and everything like dread. While the rest of the room reacted to the envelope itself, Sophia was already reacting to her mother's face, the way her eyes darted toward Diane for half a second before returning to Marcus, the way her jaw was set too tightly for a woman supposedly relieved to finally be free. Sophia did not stand up. She did not say anything. But she was the only person in that ballroom who left that night with more questions than certainty, and it was that same instinct that would eventually push her to confront her mother directly, weeks before anyone else was willing to. The guests who remained in the ballroom after Marcus walked out spent the rest of the evening rewriting the story in real time, the way rooms full of witnesses always do. Some whispered that they had seen this coming for years, that Marcus had always seemed slightly out of place among people like the Callaways. Others whispered the opposite, that Renata must have finally cracked under pressure none of them understood, that something darker had to be behind a decision, this public and this cruel. Diane moved through the room, accepting quiet condolences with practiced grace, careful never to look too satisfied in front of the wrong pair of eyes, while Bradley replayed his recording for anyone who asked to see it, already imagining how quickly this story would spread through every circle that had ever doubted his family's version of events. What none of them noticed, except perhaps their daughter Sophia, was that Renata did not sit back down in relief once Marcus was gone. She stood frozen in the middle of the dance floor, staring at her phone, her face draining of every ounce of color, because a new message had just arrived from a number she did not recognize, and it made it clear that one night of public humiliation had not been enough to satisfy the people her family owed. Marcus did not go home that night. He drove for nearly an hour, with no destination in mind, the manila envelope sitting untouched on the passenger seat, before he finally pulled into the parking lot of the one person he trusted more than anyone in his professional life, his longtime attorney, Vanessa Cole. She had handled every contract, every negotiation, every quiet legal detail of his company for over a decade, and when Marcus walked into her office that night still in his anniversary suit, She knew immediately that whatever had happened was not a simple end to a marriage. Marcus did not ask her how to fight the divorce. He asked her a single question that told her exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. He asked her to find out why. Vanessa began quietly, the way any good attorney begins, by pulling the paperwork itself apart line by line. The first detail that caught her attention was the filing date on Renata's signature, which had been notarized nearly 2 weeks before the anniversary party, not signed spontaneously in a moment of anger the way public humiliation usually implied. The second detail was the notary's office itself, one Vanessa recognized immediately as a firm regularly used by Gordon Kessler, the Calloway family's attorney, not by anyone Renata had ever worked with independently. Whatever this divorce was, it had been planned, drafted, and executed on a timeline that had nothing to do with a wife's sudden decision on the night of a party. Someone else had written the first act of this story, and Renata had simply been handed the role to perform. Vanessa's first working theory, the one she almost committed to fully before the facts pulled her elsewhere, was the simplest and most common one in cases like this. Perhaps Renata had simply grown tired of being married to a man her family never respected, and had arranged the public filing as a way of finally aligning herself fully with the Calloway name, trading one identity for another in front of the community that mattered most to her. It was a reasonable theory. It explained the notarization date, it explained Gordon Kessler's involvement, and for nearly 4 days, Vanessa built her strategy around preparing Marcus for a straightforward, if humiliating, financial separation. It was only when she pulled the property and asset filings tied to the Calloway estate that the theory started to fall apart, because nothing in Renata's newly filed paperwork asked for anything close to what a woman trying to secure her financial future through a public divorce would typically demand. For the first several days, the story circulating through Charlotte's social circles told itself the way Diane Calloway had always intended it to. Old friends took sides quickly, most of them assuming Marcus had finally done something to deserve the humiliation the Calloway family had clearly been waiting years to deliver. Sophia, caught directly in the middle, refused to speak to either parent, unable to reconcile the mother who had raised her with the woman who had just destroyed her father in front of 200 people. Marcus said nothing publicly, which only fed the assumption that guilt, not dignity, was keeping him quiet. Among the 200 people who had watched the envelope change hands that night, only a handful reached out to Marcus directly in the days that followed, most too uncertain of what they had actually witnessed to know what to say. One longtime employee, a dispatch coordinator who had worked with Marcus since the earliest days of the warehouse, called him not to ask what happened, but simply to say that whatever the truth turned out to be, the people who mattered most already knew who Marcus was after 20 years of watching him keep his word. It was a small gesture, but it reminded Marcus, in the middle of the loneliest weeks of his life, that the story circulating through Charlotte's dinner parties was not the only story that mattered. Meanwhile, Diane made sure to be seen at every social gathering that week, accepting sympathy with the same careful composure she had shown in the ballroom, never once mentioning that her son's debts were the actual reason any of this had happened at all. The first real break came not from Renata, who had gone completely silent and unreachable, but from Harold Doyle, Marcus's former business partner from the earliest years of the company, long retired, but still deeply connected to Charlotte's old financial circles. Marcus visited him almost out of instinct, more for comfort than information, but Harold had heard something weeks earlier that he had dismissed at the time as simple family gossip. Bradley Calloway, Harold told him carefully, had gotten involved with people far more dangerous than a failed investment or an overdue loan, the kind of people who did not send lawyers when payments were missed. They sent messages. Diane, according to Harold's sources, had been managing the fallout quietly for over a year, and whatever debt Bradley owed had apparently grown too large for even the Calloway name to absorb without drawing outside attention. Harold's information came with a warning of its own. He told Marcus plainly that whatever he chose to do with what he was about to learn, he needed to move carefully, because the people involved in Bradley's debt were not the type to respond well to sudden public exposure. Harold had seen situations like this before in his decades around Charlotte's financial circles, families quietly absorbing a relative's failures for years until the debt outgrew what quiet money could handle. And every time, the families who came out of it intact were the ones who moved methodically instead of emotionally. Marcus took the warning seriously. He asked Vanessa to keep everything they found contained to the two of them for as long as possible. No leaks, no confrontations, nothing that could tip off whoever was on the other end of Bradley's debt before Marcus fully understood who he was dealing with. Vanessa cross-referenced Harold's information against the timeline of the divorce filing, and the picture that emerged made Marcus's stomach turn in a way the divorce papers themselves never had. The notarization date lined up almost exactly with a series of wire transfers Bradley had attempted and failed to complete. The choice to file publicly at the one event that guaranteed 200 witnesses and immediate community-wide attention was not designed to humiliate Marcus for pleasure. It was designed to create the appearance of instability inside Marcus's personal life at the exact moment his merger was preparing to close. Instability that could delay the deal, freeze certain assets temporarily, and buy Diane Calloway the exact amount of time she needed to quietly resolve her son's debt before it became public enough to threaten the family name entirely. Renata had not humiliated her husband to hurt him. She had been positioned as the only lever her mother had left to pull. Marcus sat with that information for a long time before he said anything to anyone. Somewhere underneath the anger he still carried from that ballroom, a colder, more focused version of himself was beginning to take shape. The same version of himself that had built a company out of nothing, while an entire family quietly doubted he ever would. He was no longer asking why his wife had done this to him. He was asking what she had been protecting him from, and more importantly, what she was still protecting him from right now, in real time, while everyone around her believed the story was already over. Renata had not disappeared by choice. For nearly 2 weeks after the anniversary party, she stayed inside her mother's guest house, on the edge of the Calloway estate, cut off from her own phone, except for the number that kept sending her messages, watched closely enough by Diane that even Sophia's calls went unanswered. She replayed that ballroom moment every night, the image of Marcus reading those papers in silence, the 3 seconds he looked at her before walking away, and she understood that whatever she had done to protect him, she may have already lost him in the process. What she did not know was that Marcus, working quietly with Vanessa Cole and the information Harold Doyle had handed him, was no longer the same man who had walked out of that party believing his marriage had simply ended. It was Sophia who finally broke through. She had spent 3 weeks refusing to speak to either parent, but watching her mother grow thinner and more withdrawn every time she managed to see her convinced Sophia that whatever story the rest of Charlotte believed, it was not the whole truth. She confronted Renata directly, refusing to leave the guest house until her mother told her something real, and what came out over the next hour was not a confession of betrayal, it was a confession of fear. Renata showed her daughter the messages she had been receiving, the threats that had arrived the very night of the party, the instructions Gordon Kessler had delivered on her mother's behalf weeks before Renata ever stood up holding that envelope. Sophia called her father that same night. Marcus arrived at the guest house without calling ahead, and when Renata opened the door and saw him standing there, she did not reach for an excuse. She reached for her phone and, with hands that had not stopped shaking since the night of the party, showed him everything. The messages threatening Bradley, the instructions from Gordon Kessler about the exact timing and location the filing needed to happen in order to create the appearance Diane needed for the merger's delay. The 3 sleepless nights she had spent deciding between warning her husband and protecting her brother from people who did not send lawyers. They sent consequences. Marcus stood in that doorway, reading messages that rewrote the entire story of the worst night of his life. And for the first time since the ballroom, he understood that the woman who had humiliated him in front of 200 people had done it while more afraid than she had ever been in 22 years of marriage. The full picture, once Vanessa laid it out with the paper trail she had built, was worse than even Renata had understood while she was living inside it. Bradley's debt had grown over 18 months, quietly serviced by Diane through accounts even Renata had not known existed, until the people holding that debt stopped accepting partial payments and started making demands that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with leverage. They wanted Marcus's merger delayed long enough for a separate deal of their own to close first, one that depended on the same regional distribution contracts Marcus's company was about to lock down. A public divorce, timed perfectly, created exactly the kind of instability that could push the merger's closing date back by months, and Diane Calloway, faced with a choice between her daughter's marriage and her son's safety, made the decision without ever asking Renata if she was willing to make it herself. Marcus sat with Renata for a long time that night, longer than either of them expected, and the conversation that followed was not about forgiveness yet. It was about understanding. He asked her why she never simply told him the truth from the beginning, and Renata's answer was the one that finally broke through everything he had been holding onto since that ballroom. She told him that the people threatening Bradley had made it clear that if Marcus found out and reacted the way anyone would expect him to, with lawyers, with police, with public exposure, they would make sure the consequences landed on Bradley immediately, and possibly on Marcus's company as well, before any of it could be stopped. She had chosen to let 200 people believe she had betrayed her husband, because the alternative was watching her brother pay a price she could not undo. Marcus did not answer right away. He simply sat with her in silence, the same silence he had carried out of that ballroom weeks earlier, except this time it did not feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of a decision only he could make. Before he decided anything else, Marcus made one more stop, at the Calloway estate itself, standing in Diane's sitting room for the first time since the anniversary party. He did not raise his voice. He simply laid out, calmly and precisely, everything Vanessa had uncovered. The notarization date, Gordon Kessler's involvement, the timeline that lined up too perfectly with Bradley's failed wire transfers to be coincidence. Diane did not deny it. She sat across from him with the same composed expression she had worn at every dinner for 22 years, and told him plainly that she had done what any mother would do to protect her son, and that she expected Marcus, of all people, to understand what it meant to do whatever was necessary to protect the people you loved. Marcus told her, just as plainly, that the difference between them was that he had never once asked someone else to carry the cost of his protection in silence. He left without raising his voice, and Diane was left sitting alone in a room that suddenly felt far less secure than it had 3 weeks earlier. Marcus did not choose revenge, even though every part of that ballroom moment had given him every reason to. Instead, he went back to Vanessa Cole with a different question entirely. Not how do I expose the Calloways, but how do I make their leverage disappear completely, so quickly and so quietly that the people threatening Bradley would have no reason left to keep pushing. Vanessa reviewed the merger contracts line by line and found exactly what Marcus needed, a clause allowing an accelerated closing if both parties agreed to finalize ahead of schedule. Within days, Marcus and his merger partners quietly agreed to close the deal nearly 6 weeks earlier than planned, removing the exact window of instability the debt collectors had been counting on to force a delay. The moment the merger closed, the leverage Diane Calloway had spent 3 weeks building around her daughter's marriage simply ceased to exist. The final days before the accelerated closing were tense in a way Marcus had never experienced in over a decade of building his company. Lawyers on both sides worked through the night, reviewing terms that would normally have taken weeks to finalize, and Vanessa stayed close to Marcus through all of it, aware that a single misstep, a single leaked detail about why the timeline had suddenly shifted, could unravel everything they had worked to protect. Marcus signed the final documents at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, 6 weeks ahead of the original schedule, and the first person he called afterward was not a business partner or a reporter. It was Renata, still staying quietly at the guest house, still uncertain whether their marriage would survive what had happened. He told her only that it was done, and that whatever came next between them, the danger she had spent 3 weeks trying to protect him from, no longer had any hold over either of them. Gordon Kessler, the attorney who had drafted the divorce papers at Diane's direction, found himself in a position he had not anticipated once Vanessa's paper trail became impossible to ignore. He had drafted those papers believing he was simply serving a long-time client's instructions, the way attorneys often do, without asking every uncomfortable question behind a request. When Marcus's team made clear exactly how thoroughly the timeline had been documented, Kessler distanced himself from the Calloway family almost immediately, unwilling to have his own name tied to a scheme that had used a marriage as leverage against a merger involving 300 jobs. It was a quiet professional retreat, no headlines, no public statement, simply an attorney who understood exactly how much exposure he had just avoided by stepping back before it was too late. With the merger secured, Marcus turned his attention to Bradley's debt itself, not out of loyalty to the Calloway name, but because he understood that as long as that debt remained unresolved, Renata and Sophia would never be free of the fear that had driven this entire story from the beginning. Harold Doyle, still connected to people who understood exactly how these situations were handled quietly and legally, guided Marcus toward the right channel, one that allowed the debt and the people behind it to be reported through proper financial authorities, without exposing Bradley to the retaliation Diane had feared for months. It was not forgiveness, it was Marcus choosing to end the danger permanently rather than let his wife's family carry it in silence for another year. Diane Calloway had spent 3 weeks believing she had bought her family time and protected her son the only way she knew how. Instead, she watched the merger close early, the debt collapse under its own legal exposure, and her daughter's marriage, the very thing she had used as collateral, become the one relationship in this entire story that refused to break the way she had planned it to. Bradley, faced for the first time with the real consequences of the choices that had put his sister in that position, did not offer an apology so much as a quiet, uncomfortable silence. The same silence Marcus remembered from every family dinner where he had never quite been considered enough. In the months that followed, Bradley took a job, his first steady one in years, working under the supervision of the financial authorities who now monitored the restitution plan tied to his debt. It was not redemption. It was accountability, arriving years later than it should have, but arriving all the same. The nearly 300 employees whose futures had unknowingly hung in the balance that night never learned the full details of what had almost delayed their merger. They simply noticed that the deal closed early, that their positions were more secure than ever, and that Marcus, in the months following the anniversary party that so many of them had attended, seemed somehow both more guarded and more present than he had been in years. Legacy, for Marcus, had never simply meant the size of a company or the closing of a deal. It meant the drivers who trusted him with their families' futures, the coordinators who had watched him build something real out of almost nothing, and the quiet knowledge that he had protected all of it without ever needing revenge to do it. Marcus and Renata did not simply return to the marriage they had before that night. They rebuilt something different, slower, more honest, built on the understanding that protecting each other sometimes meant telling the truth, even when the truth was frightening, rather than carrying it alone. 22 years had taught them how to survive being underestimated by a family that never fully accepted either of them. What came after that anniversary party taught them something they had never needed before: how to trust each other completely, even after watching one another at their most afraid. Sophia, who had been the first to notice her mother's trembling hands and the last to give up on the truth beneath them, would later say that the real story of that anniversary party was never about an envelope at all. It was about how easily 200 people could watch the same moment and see 200 different things, and how rarely anyone stopped to ask what they might be missing beneath the surface of what looked, at first glance, like the simplest explanation in the room. Marcus never held a second ceremony, never staged a public reversal to answer the one that had humiliated him in that ballroom. He didn't need 200 witnesses to know what was true anymore. What mattered to him was smaller and quieter than that: the drivers who still trusted him with their roots, the daughter who had believed in her mother when almost no one else did, and the wife who had spent 3 weeks willing to be hated by the one person whose opinion mattered most to her, rather than let harm reach the people she loved. Some marriages end in a single moment. Others are tested by one and come out the other side changed but intact, carrying a kind of honesty they never had before the night everything nearly fell apart. Renata's name was cleared, not in a courtroom, but in a much smaller gathering than the anniversary party had ever been. A handful of the people who mattered most, including Sophia, hearing directly from Renata and Vanessa exactly what had happened and why. There was no dramatic public reversal, no 200 guests watching the truth unfold the way they had watched the lie unfold weeks earlier. Some stories end loudest in the same room they began in. This one ended quietly, among the people who actually deserved to understand it. The gathering took place in Marcus and Renata's own home, not the Callaway estate, not a rented ballroom, just close friends and family who had stood by them through 3 uncertain weeks. Vanessa walked the small group through the timeline plainly: the notarization date, the messages, the accelerated merger closing, careful never to turn the moment into a performance the way the anniversary party had been. Sophia stood beside her mother the entire time, something she had not done since before the party, and when Renata finished speaking, it was Sophia who spoke first, telling the room that she had never once doubted her mother's love, only the story everyone else had been so quick to believe. A few of the guests who had whispered the loudest in the weeks after the party sat in silence, quietly recalculating everything they thought they understood. Word of what really happened reached the wider Charlotte social circles slowly, the way real truth usually spreads, compared to how quickly a public humiliation had spread weeks earlier. There was no single dramatic reveal, no headline moment. Instead, the story shifted person by person, conversation by conversation, until the version everyone had accepted so easily on the night of the party no longer matched the version most people now understood to be true. Diane never publicly admitted what she had done. She did not need to. The people who mattered most already knew, and the silence that followed her through those same social circles she had spent decades curating said more than any confession ever could have. If you were sitting in that ballroom the night Renata Whitfield placed that envelope into her husband's hands, would you have believed what everyone else believed, or would you have noticed, the way Sophia did, that something about her hands, about her eyes, did not match the story the rest of the room assumed they were watching? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Marcus's place, and if this story moved you. There are more stories just like it waiting for you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.